Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely epic story of sovereignty, wealth, and raw power. We're going to focus our lens on a really specific, incredibly vital geographic region of the Indian subcontinent, the areas historically known as Magadha and Bengal. You see, this one region has basically served as the fulcrum of history. It's a place that literally birthed one of the greatest golden ages the world has ever seen. But it also became ground zero for one of the most dramatic collapses of sovereign power. Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly does the very same geographic region that gave us the approximation of pi, the foundations of modern surgery, and oh yeah, the invention of the number zero, eventually succumb to outright corporate extraction? Seriously? How does a land of just unimaginable wealth end up completely losing its sovereignty to a foreign trading company? Well, that is exactly the journey we're taking today. So, here's the roadmap for our journey. 1. The Indian Golden Age. 2. Science, art, and wealth. 3. The fracture of power. Then we make a huge jump to the 18th century for 4. The tipping point, 1764. 5. The Battle of Buxar. And finally, 6. Dawn of the British Raj. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the Indian Golden Age, the rise of the Gupta Empire. So the Gupta power base originated right in the Magadha region. Think modern-day Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And honestly, it's fascinating how rapidly they consolidated power. In the late 3rd century, Sri Gupta established the early rule, but it was his successor, Chandragupta I, who really elevated the dynasty. He strategically married into the highly powerful Lichavi family and just straight up adopted the title King of Great Kings. Talk about a power move, right? Then came his son, Samudragupta, who unleashed this massive wave of military expansion and strategic alliances. Within a really short time, he brought a huge chunk of the Indo-Gangetic Plain under unified sovereign control. Moving on to Section 2, Science, Art, and Wealth, the peak of ancient sovereignty. This massive unification triggered an absolute explosion of intellect and economic prosperity. I mean, we're talking about Aryabhata developing the base 10 numeral system and approximating pi. We have the Susruta Samhita detailing incredibly complex surgical procedures way ahead of its time. They even invented Chaturanga, which is the strategic military game that eventually evolved into chess. Plus, you've got the foundation of Nalanda University, easily one of the world's very first great residential universities. And this brilliantly illustrates a universal historical truth. When you have incredible economic stability and massive wealth pouring in from global Silk Road trade, that is exactly what fuels this kind of groundbreaking world-changing innovation. But hey, you don't just have to take my word for it. Let's look at Foxian. He was a Chinese Buddhist monk who actually traveled through the empire back in the 5th century. He wrote, "The people are numerous and hacky. The king governs without decapitation or corporal punishments. Criminals are simply fined." I mean, wow. That is an absolutely glowing primary source review of Gupta prosperity. It really highlights a society with super mild taxation, fair governance, and immense civic freedom. People didn't even have to register their households. The wealth stayed local, and the people absolutely thrived. Which brings us to Section 3, the fracture of power, the end of the Golden Age. Now, as we know, history is rarely just a straight line of endless prosperity. The magnificent Gupta Empire eventually began to crumble, really due to a cascading series of massive pressures. First off, they faced repeated, exhausting invasions by the Hunas from the northwest, which just massively drained the empire's military and financial resources. As the center got weaker, regional rulers smelled blood in the water and rose up to challenge that central authority. Add to this some pretty severe environmental disasters, like devastating mid-6th century floods in UP and Bihar that totally disrupted the agricultural backbone of their economy. So the result? The subcontinent fragmented into smaller, competing kingdoms. The loss of that sovereign wealth and those crucial trade monopolies left the entire region fractured and deeply vulnerable. And that sets the stage for Section 4, the tipping point, 1764, the East India Company in Bengal. All right, let's fast forward over a millennium to the exact same geographic region, Bihar and Bengal. And the reality here couldn't be more different. It's now the 18th century, and the spark for a massive world-altering conflict wasn't actually a military invasion. Ironically, it was just bureaucratic tax evasion. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it started. The Mughal Empire had granted the British East India Company specific trade privileges and tax exemptions. These were known as Dosteks and Farmans. But company officials ruthlessly abused these passes to bypass customs duties for their own private illicit trade. This systemic fraud absolutely devastated the local Nawab's treasury, and it completely crushed local Indian merchants who simply couldn't compete with a tax-free megacorporation. Enter Mir Qasim, the Nawab of Bengal. He finally decides enough is enough and attempts to reassert his sovereignty. He moves his capital away from British influence all the way to Munger in Bihar, and he starts building up a modern army. To stop the British tax evasion dead in its tracks, he makes a super bold move. He completely abolishes all customs duties. For everyone. He just totally levels the playing field for Indian traders. Well, the East India Company, furious at losing their unfair advantage, demands their privileges back immediately. War becomes inevitable. So Mir Qasim forms a massive anti-British alliance with Shuja Udala, the Nawab Azwawed, and Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor. This leads us right to Section 5, the Battle of Buxar. The trap closes. So, the pieces were set on the chessboard. On October 22, 1764, the two sides violently clashed. The Indian alliance actually had a massive numerical advantage, but the British forces, led by Major Hector Munro, utilized incredibly superior military organization, coordinated flanking maneuvers, and highly disciplined firepower. The Allied Indian forces were completely encircled and suffered extremely heavy losses. Mir Qasim fled, and the other key leaders surrendered. It was a total, crushing military defeat that would echo across the subcontinent for centuries. And finally, Section 6. Dawn of the British Raj, the aftermath of conquest. You see, the battlefield victory was really just the beginning. The actual long-term devastation happened in the boardroom. Under the 1765 Treaty of Allahabad, which was negotiated by Robert Clive, the Nawab of Awadh had to cede huge tracts of territory and pay a massive war indemnity of 50 lakh rupees. The Mughal emperor basically became a pensioner of the company. But the ultimate prize? The company forced the emperor to grant them the Diwani. This was the absolute right to collect all the revenues of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The East India Company essentially instituted a dual government. So the crucial point is, they took all the money but cleverly left the actual responsibility of governing the people to the now powerless local Nawab. To truly understand the sheer scale of this extraction, look at this number: 26 million rupees. That was the staggering annual payment the company agreed to give the emperor in exchange for those Diwani rights. They systematically secured the vast wealth of India's richest provinces to fund their own corporate expansion and colonial armies. They effectively turned the region's own resources against itself. But, the extortion went even deeper. 53 million rupees. This was the massive annual tribute the practically powerless emperor was forced to pay back to the company for the so-called upkeep of those very same provinces. They were systematically bankrupting the local economy, extorting the cultivators, and destroying local trade just to maximize their corporate bottom line. Let's move to and see how this builds. Because when we place these two eras side by side, we get this ultimate devastating contrast. On one side, you have Foxian's description of the region during the Gupta era in the 5th century: mild laws, happy people, and wealth retained locally to fuel a literal scientific golden age. On the other side, the exact same region under the East India Company's dual government in the 18th century. We're talking mass unemployment as artisans had to abandon their trades, widespread corruption, the total collapse of the silk and cotton industries, and ultimately the horrific Great Bengal Famine of 1770. The history of Magadha and Bengal shows us something really profound. It shows that a civilization's peak is fundamentally driven by its ability to control and invest its own wealth. The Battle of Buxar proved that conquering a nation's wealth is the absolute fastest way to conquer its people. The East India Company didn't just win a war, they legally mandated the extraction of an entire region's prosperity. And it leaves us with a lingering, truly vital question to ask about our modern world. When you look at the complex systems around us right now, who controls the wealth today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity to look a little closer at the hidden mechanics of history.